Hi all. Today we're gonna talk about the Chigorin defense. It's a defense against the queen's pawn opening for black. It starts out with d4, d5, c4, the queen's gambit, and knight to c6, the signature move. There are other moves like the Slav defense with c6 and the queen's gambit decline with e6. The idea, if we flip the board, the idea for white is to exert pressure on the d5 point. Black has to react to this in some way or another, right? Either e6, c6, taking, or knight to c6, even e5. But today we're going to explore the Chigorin defense. So black's idea is to get a lead in development very quickly and to essentially tell white, hey, if you're going to attack my d5 pawn, then I'm going to exert influence in the center on your d4 pawn. Very often, black tries to play for e7 to e5 very quickly, and we'll look at some lines where white tries to prevent this plan with e5, but it ends up not being good for white, or not ideal, so to speak. And one move that does that is bishop to f4, trying to prevent e5, but in fact, e5 still actually works here. Despite the fact that it's hanging a pawn, d4, this position is okay for black. You can also go bishop to b4. First, really quickly, let's look what happens after bishop takes e5. Here, black wants to take, and after d takes, play bishop to b4, knight to c3, knight to e7. Don't play d4, because queen a4 just wins a piece. You cannot defend this bishop while getting out of check. So you have to play knight to e7. And the idea is after queen to a4, you just play knight to c6, which is often what happens. And after castling queenside, d4, this position is a little unclear. It's sound for black. Black has some play here with a future queen to g5 and bishop to f5 and developing really quickly. Black should be okay here. Let's go back. D takes e5. Here, I'm going to suggest d4, knight to f3, knight ge7 with the idea of going to g6 to exert more pressure on the e5 pawn and the bishop, of course. Knight bd2, knight to g6, and g3. Here, you can try a5. There was a game here, I believe this was a game between a guy named Rabiega and Ruse. Rabiega is 2500. a5. The idea of a5 here, and the reason I would suggest it, is because to prevent a future a3 and b4, which would totally would put this bishop out of play. So bishop g5, and here you can play bishop to e7, or you can also play queen to d7 actually, because you want to bring the bishop to b4. This is really where it belongs, and then you're going to castle kingside, and take the pawn, and this queen is going to move later, and the bishop's going to get out. So these are the two options you have here. After bishop takes e7, you can take with the queen, bishop g2, castle, rook to d8. Black is doing fine here because you cannot hold on to this pawn for white. So, okay, let's go back. This is what happens after bishop f4. It has no popularity anymore because e5 is playable against it. Other moves. knight to c3, exerting influence in the d5 square. Here, you have two options you can take, and I'm not going to cover this too much, but I think it is the best move because now bishop g5 is not a move that white can play. For example, after knight f6, which is the option I'm going to cover, white can play bishop g5. This is the best move because this knight is guarding the d5 pawn, and essentially white wants to take so that the d5 pawn is under a lot of pressure. Here, the best, objectively speaking, is probably knight to e4, but it's also not very great. I would take. This is okay for black. And after knight f3, you can play h6, take, e3, bishop d6, bishop takes c4, castle, castle, knight e7. The general consensus is that white has a small advantage, but at the same time, black has merits too. He can play for f5 and grip on the e4 square, and it's not very clear how white is going to attack black. Black is kind of solid here. In this position, it's going to be more a matter of positional play and tactics more than about strategy. So I think you should be fine here, but anyway, let's go back. Instead of bishop g5, they can also play c takes d5. Here, you should take. White will play knight to f3, trying to prevent e5, but in fact, it doesn't prevent e5 because you can play it, and if take, bishop b4, bishop d2, knight takes, pawn takes is best. If bishop takes, then you can take, and then play queen e7. You're going to win this pawn and develop very quickly. Black is doing fine here. So b takes, avoiding the essentially avoiding the piece trade. Bishop a5, e3, castle, queen a4. This is an interesting idea. The idea is to go to f4 to guard the e5 pawn. But this is kind of getting far into theory. So we're not going to look further because this is a specific game played by Aronian, I believe. But what you should know is in these kind of positions, you just want to win this pawn back and then just establish a lead in development if at all possible, which is often the case because white often has to move pieces multiple times to guard certain points and weak spots. Okay, if knight takes e5, then I would recommend knight takes c3. First, let's look at b takes c3. Here, play knight takes, d takes, queen takes d1, king takes, and bishop f5. Black has better results here than white, so no problems at all. Black's development is superior, and he's gonna castle. Knight takes c6 is best. Knight takes d1, knight takes d8, knight takes b2, desperadoing the knight. Knight takes b7 is a blunder for white, believe it or not. Instead, best move here is just bishop takes b2. And then after bishop b4 and king d1 and king takes, this position is equal. Very drawish, in fact. But if they play knight takes b7, which you might see, then they're about to lose a piece because of bishop b4 check. Bishop d2 is forced. Bishop takes. King takes. Bishop b7. These two pieces are undefended, so white might try rook to b1, but it doesn't help because you can throw in a check, and now you're going to guard the bishop on b7. And now black is a piece up, a minor piece up. No good for white. Let's go back towards the beginning. Okay, next let's cover c takes d5. Here you should take. Now black is attacking the d4 pawn twice. Therefore white has to guard it in one way or another. Either e3, which is the best move, or knight to f3. You don't have time to play knight c3 because black takes and wins a pawn. So let's look at knight f3 first. Again, trying to prevent e5, but as a matter of fact, it doesn't prevent e5. So e5, d takes e5, queen takes, king takes, bishop g4, bishop f4, because black was threatening to capture to win the pawn. For example, if h3, then you take, and then you win the pawn. So bishop f4, guarding the pawn on e5. Knight ge7, intending to go to g6. We saw a similar plan earlier. Knight c3, knight g6, bishop g3, castle queenside, king e1, bishop e4. And black is doing great here because of his development advantage, and he's going to win the pawn back. No problems here. Okay, now if e3, I would still play e5 here. Knight c3 attacking the queen. Bishop b4 pinning the knight to the king. Bishop d2 breaking the pin. Here you should take. Bishop takes. E takes d4. And now white has to be careful. Knight e2 is the best move here. If you take with the pawn, then this pawn is now isolated, meaning no other pawns can defend it. There's no pawns on this file or this file for white. So this pawn is very loose. And in fact, this bishop on c3 would rather be a knight in this position to kick the queen off of the d5 square. But since it's a bishop and since it's misplaced, this position is very awkward and uncomfortable for white. Black has, on top of that, good prospects and good results. No problems. So knight e2, best. Don't take because the queen is hanging. So after knight e2, black should play knight f6. Knight takes d4. Castle. Bishop to e2 is interesting because taking is actually very risky. After bishop to f3, queen to g6, knight takes, b takes, queen to d4 exclam, intending to castle queenside, and a future rook g1 to, for example, if a move like bishop b7, which is not a bad move, and if black does a nothing move like a6, then it can get really bad because of rook g1. And let's say, okay, well, first of all, if you go queen to f6, then you can simply take because this pawn on g7 is pinned, so you cannot capture because it's pinned. And what else? If queen to h6, the same story, right? So this is very dangerous for black. So I wouldn't really take on g2 unless you really know what you are doing. Even then, white is still considered to have a concrete advantage. Instead, I would recommend knight to e4, knight takes, queen takes, bishop to d4, If a move like bishop to f3, then you can take because you're attacking the queen. Black has no problems here. You can analyze this for yourself. So bishop d4, queen g6, castle, and now we reach towards the middle game, and the consensus here is that black is doing fine, but that white has a slight positional advantage due to the bishop pair. But black is okay still because he has a dangerous attack, and you can look up a game where this position was reached and actually black won. This was between Perdomo and Riccardi, and it continued with rook to c1 and c6, and I won't go over it, but basically black had a strong kingside attack and eventually brought his rooks to the king's side, like far in the future, and it was really dangerous for white. Okay, let's go all the way back. Okay, knight c6. Let's take a look at e3 really quickly. This is no problem because of e5. And you have to know d takes and d4 is best here, essentially transposing into the Albin counter gambit at least one line, and that's okay. Albin counter gambit is not bad, and it's also dangerous. And then obviously against this you would just take, and you have better piece influence, and this bishop is awkward with the pawns on e3 and d4. One final line I'm going to cover is the best line, the main line, knight to f3. The reason this is the best move is because it actually prevents e5. e5 is now bad here because of d takes e5, d4, and it's not horrible per se, but you know, I'm going to check engine really quickly. It likes knight takes e5. Interesting. And g3. Plus 0.7. Ooh. Very interesting. I didn't know this. I just knew that it was bad, is all. So, yeah, don't play e5 is the important aspect here. Let me turn engine off. Okay. Instead, you have to play bishop to g4. This is another move that is universally played in such positions. C takes d5. And now bishop takes f3, exclam, removing a defender of the d4 pawn. If white wants to play an advantage, or play for an advantage, then you have to take g takes. If you take, then you take with the bishop, and black has equality after knight c3, knight f6, f3, e5 exclam, d takes e5, knight to d7, e4, knight takes e5. This is equal, and probably a more pleasant for black because, again, you have a slight development advantage. Instead, white should take g takes, queen takes, e3, e5, intending bishop to b4, knight c3 naturally, bishop b4 naturally, getting ready to get rid of a second bishop, for a second knight. And what is the purpose? To generate pressure in the position. With the knights influencing so much in the center, it's easier to generate pressure with the knights than the bishops. So essentially, black is using the bishops to generate pressure because he kind of doesn't really need the bishops. But at the same time, after bishop d2, bishop takes c3, b takes c3. Um, White can claim an advantage due to the bishop pair and also the ability to play for e3 to e4 in the future. And also rook to b1 is a very important resource later on that gives white a theoretical advantage. Here, queen to d6, anticipating pawn to e4. Rook to b1, pawn to b6, and now the interesting move, f4. If you play e4, then this pawn on d4 is simply hanging. You can take, and now black is up a pawn for no compensation. So e4 here is a blunder. You cannot play e4 right away. Instead, f4. The idea is after e takes f4, what do you think white plays? e4. He's going to go queen f3 and pick up the pawn on f4, and the central pawns in the bishop pair are slightly more worthwhile than the pawn structure detriments of white. So white can claim an advantage. But again, it's kind of unclear, and black has somewhat of an initiative in some areas. It's a very interesting middle game that arises. Knight ge7, queen f3, castle, bishop takes f4. You can play queen a3 here, and after bishop e2 and f5, it gets very sharp, because this king is a little bit unsafe, but white has more to play for. And we're going to stop here and draw conclusions. By the way, also queen e6 is another move here. So what is the philosophy of the Chigorin defense? It's to sacrifice the use of the c-pawn in order to gain an advantage in development. Also to sacrifice the bishop pair for an initiative and a strike in the center. The very important themes you have to know with the Chigorin defense is to play for e5 if you can, and if it doesn't work, then you want to exert influence in the center with moves like bishop to g4 and bishop to b4, and just develop your pieces very quickly. Very often you will castle queenside and bring both rooks to the center. The development schematic for black here is very natural. And that's about it. I hope that this video helped you. I hope I covered important aspects. If you are interested in playing the Chigorin defense, then I think this is all you really need to know to get started. From this point on, it's all about understanding the middle games that arise of the Chigorin defense. I pretty much covered all the important opening moves that you need to know. So I hope this helps. I'll see you later. Bye for now.